Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you for the opportunity. All right, so indigenous languages in a space contested by Spanish and British hegemonies. That's kind of what I want to talk about, and particularly the case of Yucatec Maya community in Western Belize. So around the mid 90s, as a teenager, I was interviewed along with my parents and one of my brothers in my parents' living room. And this anthropologist asked us two questions. She asked us, are you Maya? And who is Maya? And I responded first, and I said, well, I think I'm Maya, but I have trouble calling myself Maya because I really don't speak the language. And especially when I'm with other people who speak the language, then I feel uncomfortable. My brother's response was pretty much similar. He's just 4 years younger than I am, except that he thought that maybe he was mestizo because he couldn't quite call himself Maya. My dad answered next, and in his witty way, he says, well, I know I'm not a dog, and I know I'm not a cat. I am Maya. I don't know what else I could be. I understand the language. I do not speak it well, but it's not my fault. My mom immediately answered, and she pretty much shared the same thing as my dad. Just at that moment, my grandfather, who was in his late 90s, walked in, and if anybody was Maya, he was the real thing. So we thought we'd ask him. I said, Grandpa, are you Maya? And he said, yes, without thinking about it. And I said, well, who is Maya? And again, without much thought, he says, well, Maya is somebody who speaks Maya. I said, but what about your daughter, my mom? She doesn't speak Maya. Is she Maya? I thought I would, kind of catch him. And he said, no, she's not Maya. She's an Indian. We all laughed and said, so she was not mestizo, she was not Maya, she was an Indian. But after laughing, and over the years, I've wondered, my family was sort of converted from Maya to sort of uncomfortable mestizos, uncertain Maya, and ultimately Indians as people without without a language. And so I kind of explored that question over the years, and recently through some interviews and some archival work. Just for context, so Belize is this tiny country in Central America, and Socots is right there at the border with Guatemala and Belize. And Belize was really carved out of Mayan territory, the whole region having been colonized by the Spanish. And though they never settled in Belize, they obviously influenced and considered their territory. Anyway, Belize was carved out of that space through contestation between two empires, the Spanish and the British. Essentially, they constructed this territory as being no man's land, as terra nullius, and by either symbolically or physically removing Maya people from the territory, and in the process reconfiguring the land, reconfiguring the people. People essentially and land acquire meaning only by being emplaced within the colonial economy. In what Quijano says, two things. One of them, the construction of biological difference into a hierarchy of race, where white is at the top and black and African and indigenous peoples at the bottom. And two, by the subjugation of land and people into the emerging capital economy. In a sense, the language experience of Maya people can be understood from exactly that framework, in the sense that just as how the territory was defined as an empty territory, linguistic territory, Mayan linguistic territory was defined as empty, so lingua nullis. Whatever language that Maya people spoke was not considered a language, and the only way they could be considered people and human beings was to be acquire the colonizers' language, the European language. And so acquiring that language did two things. One, it civilized them, and two, it then placed them into an economy, into that colonial economy. So let us see how kind of that played out in the case of the Maya people. So the linguistic experience of Socots, really, this community, has been really the gradual replacement of the Maya language with Spanish and now English, and of a Maya identity to this notion of no one-ness. If we look at this table, this is kind of 5 people interviewed from one single family, so 3 generations. And we can see, for example, that we start with the first language in the 1900s, being Maya, to 2007 with a grandson, Spanish and English, the language of preference being then now English. So moving from Maya to Spanish, eventually to English, and in terms of identity as well, being confidently Maya to being sort of uncomfortable Maya to perhaps it doesn't even matter whether we are Maya or not in the grandson. So in a sense, what the Maya people of Sokot's experience was this idea of Mayaness as backwardness. Being Maya meant and means being less, as you can see from the quotes there to the right. And two, one can progress from Maya to Mestizo by acquiring Spanish language and culture. So one can climb up the ladder by acquiring both the Spanish language and culture, and now English. The only possible change for Maya people was to become non-Maya. And essentially then, Maya people are the people of the past, those who built the temples, not the people of today. Maya people are those people who, like from southern Belize, where they hold their culture. So if you don't have their culture, you cannot be Maya. Again, you can see that from the quotations there to the side. The second thing, second element of that experience was that the European language is a symbol of civilization and access to privilege. In interviews that I conducted, for example, participants spoke about the importance of speaking Spanish correctly, especially the pronunciation of the double R, which should be, for example, the word reina, it should be reina and not reina, or arroz instead of arroz. And that, in fact, not pronouncing well was symbolic of being kind of backward, and especially from a remote area. There's an instance, for example, where one of the participants talks about she didn't want to dance with this young man who could not speak the language properly because it was embarrassing when he was asking for a particular song to be played by the band. So in the past, early on, Maya language sounded strange and weird to children. Today, speaking English with a Spanish accent is actually appearing as being strange and weird. So the consequence of all of this is essentially an erasure of Mayaness, but not only the erasure of Mayaness in terms of losing language and identity, but even the possibility of Mayaness. I can no longer be Maya because I don't speak the language. I can't be Maya because I don't have the culture. And you can see that, for example, in my instance, being interviewed in the mid-90s as a teenager to the son in the table there today saying, well, I by default am mestizo. I really don't call myself anything. If I have to, I call myself mestizo. I don't want to call myself anything else because I don't want to offend other ethnic groups. Maya people really are those people from Toledo who have the strong culture, who have the language, and so on. So, and does it really matter? You know what? I'm just a person. Okay, Mayaness is not important to me. So we see kind of that trend. So, does it really matter? Here's an example where Maya people are using their language to rethink their future and rethink the way they govern and create a different way of being, using the concept of a bink, which is a Maya word, which means to listen, but actually is the word for meeting. If you think about meeting from that sense, a bink, to listen, then it changes and creates space for women and young people. Finally, we still tend to think about development. Development seems to be an overarching framework for thinking about education and language education. And it implies kind of moving from traditional to modern, so leaving indigenous languages to acquiring modern languages, Spanish or English. And therefore, the implication is we really need to move away from that way of thinking to challenge the way that we think about what education is, to consider the language for people's identity and their future. With that, I want to thank you.